What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the terms are deep state. Oh dear.
investors,
Experts, diplomats.
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
Enjoy.
Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Politics and Media 101, the place where we come together live almost every day of the week to hear from people in the news, in their own words, in their own voices, and where anyone who wants to can join live to ask our guests a question or to just listen. We're just now starting to release recorded portions of some of our favorite conversations over the past few months for the first time, and we're grateful to you for joining us. Today, we're excited to release a tape of a conversation and audience Q&A we had with Dr. Francis Fukuyama. He's one of the world's leading experts on democracy, free thought, governance, and really on how different societies organize themselves, what works, and what doesn't. If you lived through 2020, COVID impacted you somehow. Every country responded differently, some with better results than others. And whether you live in a rich country or a poor country, in a free nation or a dictatorship, we talked about some issues that relate to you and that relate to really the building blocks of society itself. Not just how we all responded to COVID, but how these issues of government and organization impact the lives of every single one of us across all of humanity. We talked about media. Who can we trust? How can we find what's true? Are there checks anymore on bad information? We talked about technology companies. What are their responsibilities to all of us? We talked about identity. How do people see themselves and their needs? And how do we use this to form our political views? How do leaders play into that? In a way, political division and individual anger, at least in the US, have driven directly to the heart of places they weren't at all a few years ago, like pro sports, Olympics, and germ theory. There are few people better suited to speak to how we got here, where we're going, and what we can do today than Dr. Fukuyama. We had fantastic audience questions. We hope you'll enjoy it. And as always, if you want to hear more episodes, if you want to join us live, to listen or ask a question of an upcoming guest, or if you have comments, suggestions, or criticisms for us, please visit our website, pm101.club or pm101.live. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
how are you doing this Sunday?
I'm doing fine. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm kind of depressed about Afghanistan right now, but, that's something maybe we can talk about.
Yeah, I would love to talk about it. It's rather astonishing how quickly it all kind of happened. Is that what's most depressing to you, or did you think that the government would be able to kind of stand up?
No, I have a more immediate concern. I've got quite a number of friends and former students that are in Afghanistan right now. There's one particular family that we've been making a big effort to try to get on one of these evacuation flights because the father of the family started a girls' school and would be a target, once the Taliban took over. But, it's just so chaotic there, and it happened so quickly that I'm afraid that they're still stuck in Kabul. And I think the speed of the collapse has really confounded the administration. They honestly, they should have prepared for this contingency, but obviously they were taken by surprise. So it's the cost is going to be borne by all these poor Afghans.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely terrible. We're discussing this tomorrow with Dr. Seth Jones of CSIS. Hopefully he'll be able to get us the ins and outs of the intelligence failure, or if it's not an intelligence failure, like the House ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee said, maybe it's just a leadership failure by the current administration. But anyways, folks, this is Politics and Media 101. We'll go for about an hour here with a seminal political thought leader, one of the true influencers of not only academia and how the study of political science is thought about, discussed, but also a leader in policymaking. He himself worked in the State Department, but also is still influencing U.S. foreign policy to a large extent based on his thoughts and thinking. Professor Frank, you first rose to national prominence with your article and book, The End of History, ? And in 2018, you wrote another book titled Identity. For those of us in the audience who maybe aren't familiar with the nuance of your worldview, can you go into maybe how your worldview has stayed the same or evolved over the last 3 decades, using these two books kind of as the focal point?
Sure. So this is an explanation I've had to give repeatedly over the last 30 years, but there was a big misunderstanding of the term the end of history. This was an idea that was really articulated first by the philosopher Hegel, and then Karl Marx took it up. And in this sense, history does not mean events. It means something like modernization or development. And the end of history is really to what kind of society does modernization seem to be leading? And my argument was that the argument of the Marxists that it was leading to a communist utopia didn't look like it would come about, and that if there was a final objective of modernization, it would be something more like liberal democracy connected to a market economy. And I still do not see a superior form of government to that, but there's certainly a big change in the atmosphere between 1989 and the present, because back then we were halfway through what Sam Huntington called the third wave of democratization. And now we're in a reverse wave, which unfortunately is accelerating, at a rather dizzying pace. So the prospects for global democracy do not look good. The continuity with the new book is that I originally spoke about the threats to democracy, and one of those threats was actually the concept of identity. What I argued all the way back in The End of History and The Last Man was that people would not be satisfied just with, peace and prosperity, that they've got pride in themselves. They want to struggle for higher things. And if they're living in a society in which struggle had been taken care of, they would start struggling for other things. And I think that's the kind of world we're living in, where people want to assert identities where they feel they're not recognized. And I think that's the ground of a lot of the nationalism and also the populism that we've seen emerge in the United States and other countries. So I think, we're not in a very happy democratic world. We're one in which recognition and dignity have risen to the forefront, and it takes a lot of different forms at the moment.
Sorry to ask you that. I think it's just really important to kind of get that clarification out to start our discussion. But you had mentioned there is kind of an international struggle going on right now around the world with democracy. And before getting into our own internal issues here in the United States, I wanted to ask you about maybe the most pressing macro foreign policy issue to U.S. lawmakers, which is competition with China. And it's increasingly becoming a greater focus. And I'm wondering if you could kind of outline to what extent the PRC government represents a different model of values and system of government to the liberal world order.
Sure. So I would say that if you rewound the clock to 2013, you would say that China represented, in a way, a kind of pretty well organized authoritarian state. That is to say, they had a dictatorship of the Communist Party. They didn't permit the kind of liberties that you would expect in a liberal democracy. But it also wasn't a totalitarian dictatorship in which the government was trying to control every thought and action of its citizens. And I think that with the rise of Xi Jinping in the year 2013, it began to change. Xi has this very weird nostalgia for Maoism, and even the Cultural Revolution, where he actually, by the way, suffered. His family were sent down to the countryside, but he somehow remembers that period with some nostalgia and thinks that the Communist Party really ought to have this leading role in all aspects of life. And so the extent of the dictatorship has gone from a kind of ordinary authoritarianism to something that looks much more like the old totalitarian model of the 20th century, where the party really has clamped down on, many, many aspects of freedom. And especially given the kind of surveillance technology that exists today, they can get into, these very fine details of where you were yesterday, what you ate for lunch, who you're associating with, and certainly what you're speaking, out in public. And furthermore, I think their foreign policy had been, really focused on domestic development up until 2013. But it's been increasingly outward focused, where they want to project this authoritarian model to other countries. They're using the Belt and Road Initiative to spread their influence in virtually every part of the world. And so I think China represents a much bigger challenge than they did, and I think that's the reason that the Biden administration, this is the one area where there's been a fair amount of continuity from the Trump administration, because I think they've recognized that this is going to be a much more competitive relationship than it was before the rise of Xi.
And to really hone in on the foreign policy that you just brought up, the narrative is with the Belt and Road Initiative, at least what we hear in the West, is that China has a lot of momentum, whether it be in Latin America with a lot of their projects, in Africa. They have their first base outside of their real borders in 600 years in Djibouti. They're looking at another one on the other coast of Africa. They have investments in Pakistan. There's great fear, touching on relevant current events, of their influence growing in Afghanistan, maybe even through the Belt and Road Initiative. And conversely, you see the United States. We are in the news for not really being able to negotiate an Iran nuclear deal. We're in the news today with Afghanistan. So can you kind of help me understand who is winning in this current competition for maybe liberal values, authoritarian values, and who do you think has the upper hand in the long run?
Well, that's a big series of questions. So with regard to China, I actually do think that there's been a little bit of a panic about the Belt and Road Initiative that's a little bit reminiscent of the fears that we felt about the former Soviet Union that are exaggerated. And so I can point to, a number of Belt and Road projects that have actually been good, what the Chinese call win-win situations, that country needs a railroad or electricity and the Chinese have provided it. I think the problem there is evident in this little country of Montenegro. There's actually an article in the New York Times today about how the Chinese built this 40-kilometer stretch of highway at a huge expense that consumed, about a third of the national budget of Montenegro. They couldn't finish it, and now that little country is completely in hock to China and unable to fund, any other initiative. And this has happened in quite a few other places where the Chinese have, I think, kind of recklessly gotten small developing countries into a debt trap where they are, they've really got the upper hand. And I think that may be self-limiting, because the more countries have experiences like Montenegro's, the less attractive Chinese investment is going to seem to them. But I would say that that's a completely separate question from how the United States is doing, because, we're not doing well at all. And I think that really has to do with our domestic democracy and the fact that, the United States, its politics today really don't seem like anything of the model that it used to be, let's say 15, 20 years ago. So in that sense, I do think, China's been rising and they're at the moment doing better. Question of how that'll play out in the long run is a different one. And there, I think it's much harder to make predictions.
Well, I was hoping you could tell us the answer to the question on the test. So,
well, look, let me just say a couple of things about the longer run. I do think that, the performance of a social system really has to be judged over a long period of time. And, the argument has been for democracy that it can make a lot of mistakes, but it's got a self-corrective mechanism. Whereas if you establish a basically one-person dictatorship of the sort that China has now, if that one person makes a serious mistake or a bunch of serious mistakes, there's no accountability mechanism and there's no safeguards to prevent that from really going off the rails. It went off the rails, in the Great Leap Forward and in the Cultural Revolution under Mao, and it could easily go off the rails under Xi's guidance. And so that's why I think that, we can't come to any quick judgments about the relative merits of these systems because they really do, take some time to play out.
So, Professor, another major current event that unfortunately we're still in the midst of is COVID-19. I'm wondering, there has been drastically different responses to COVID-19 around the world based on the different types of government we have. Specifically, the CCP government cracked down immediately and appeared to get a control on the spread in their borders. The United States took a different approach, and that's just two examples. Could you kind of go into what your view on the different responses we've seen says about the different abilities of a democracy or representative republic versus an authoritarian or extremely centralized government, and their abilities to respond to existential crises?
Well, I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs last summer, in the summer of 2020, on this very subject. And I would say that if I had to do it over, I would have to take back a lot of the things that I said, because I don't, it turns out that as the pandemic has gone on for much longer than anyone expected, the relative performance of different countries has begun to change. So I do think that one thing I said is still correct, which is the fundamental distinction is not between authoritarian governments and democratic ones. I mean, you have some pretty good democratic performers, like let's say Taiwan or South Korea, and you have some really terrible ones. I think like the U.S. last year, or Brazil under President Bolsonaro. And so it's not the form of government that's right. I think that what we're seeing now is a lot of the countries that looked like they were doing well last year, like Australia or Germany, or even some of these East Asian countries, like Japan, have not been doing well. And it seems to be related to the fact that because they did well in 2020, they didn't invest in vaccines, and they didn't really plan for a big vaccination campaign. Whereas the United States, really bobbled the response to the pandemic early on. It spread, became a, severe economic and social crisis. And, one of the few things, in my view, that the Trump administration did properly was to invest a huge amount of money in warp speed in this vaccination program. And that's one of the reasons we seem to be doing better right now. I do think that there is a relationship between populism and poor performance, because a number of countries run by populist leaders like Bolsonaro in Brazil or Modi in India or Trump in the United States really did not cover themselves with glory. And I think there's probably a reason for that, that populists really don't like to do unpopular things. They don't like to tell their citizens that they've got a mask and social distance and so forth. I do think that, obviously state capacity matters a great deal. And that's why there's this persistent and growing divide between rich countries and poor countries. I mean, rich countries don't just have resources. They've also got competent states that can deliver services like healthcare, and poor countries don't. And I think, you're now seeing that a lot of poor countries under a tremendous amount of stress in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, and the like. And then finally, I do think that one factor that does make a difference is trust. If you've got a very divided country where people do not trust each other and don't trust the government, you're not going to have a successful response to a pandemic. One of the interesting things is that there's been another wave of infections in Russia. Although they developed a vaccine, Sputnik, early on, the uptake of that vaccine among Russians has been very, very low. And I think one of the reasons is that they basically don't trust their own government. And therefore, they're not willing to, to get that vaccine. And so but, as an American, you can't be, you can't stick out your chest about this, because we've also got a really big problem with trust in government. And, our vaccination program has ground to a halt because people don't trust the government and, don't trust doctors and the like.
Yeah, and looking at either, it doesn't really matter. It could be Russia, France, what we see here in the United States, in a lot of countries throughout the world. You just hit on it. There is great pushback to mask mandates, to vaccine mandates. And I was wondering whether that's just fundamentally due to a lack of trust in government, or if it's also to do with identity and how individuals view their identity and how a government could infringe upon that view of identity. And just to follow up here, what does this say about how policymakers, when they're creating mandates, when they're creating massively important but potentially divisive policies, how should they take into account identity and trusting governments, etc.?
Well, I'm afraid that identity has completely, well, not completely, but it's very strongly undermined the pandemic response in the United States, because basically these health responses have become politicized. Wearing a mask or getting the vaccine is not just seen as an individual decision regarding your own health or the health of people around you. It's seen as a marker of where you stand on this fundamental polarization between red and blue states, between red and blue citizens. And there are parts of the country where, in fact, there was a story in the paper about how a taxi company in Missouri will not take any passengers that are either wearing a mask or claim to be vaccinated. That's kind of how far this thing has gone. And it's really too bad. The causes of this, I think, are very complicated. I think that, the anti-vax movement was always there for many years, but it had been a fringe movement. And now it's kind of come front and center, where Republican governors in, Florida and Texas, have adopted that posture, for themselves as part of this broader polarization in American politics. And that is fundamentally an identity division. It's a division over certain basic cultural values about, your relationship to foreigners, to immigrants, your belief in what American national identity ought to be, whether it's this open, multiracial world or one, that looks more like the United States 50 years ago. And I think that has seeped into many corners of American life that previously were not particularly, politicized, like sports. You actually had people urging other Americans not to cheer for the American team at the Olympics because they didn't like their politics. And athletes using the Olympics, again, this is not the first time this has happened, but using that to make political statements. And so it's a very unfortunate thing, because I think that politics shouldn't be all consuming. And we ought to have a sphere where we can simply interact with each other as as citizens, and make the decision based on empirical information, expert advice, and the like.
Yeah, and in America, we are increasingly getting divided into our two tribes. So on that note, I was wondering, from your perspective that is just one of expertise, how do you view both of these parties in their stance towards liberal democracy? That's small L for everybody in the audience, liberal democracy. And do you believe the current way that these two parties are reacting towards liberal democracy is sustainable to maintain our system of governance if we don't have a massive change in paradigm?
Well, I think that the Republican Party crossed a really important threshold after January 6th. Really after November 4th of last year, when, former President Trump would not concede the election and claimed, falsely that there had been massive fraud by the Democrats. And now you're at a point where, some fairly large majority of Americans believe that Biden is not, legitimate president. And this has survived Trump, because many Republican governors and leaders are now basically pushing to either restrict access to voting, or to create procedures that would allow, a Republican legislature to overrule a Democratic choice made in some future election. They are doing this, they claim, in order to protect the integrity of elections, but it's all based on this completely false premise that there was massive fraud in last year's election, which in fact was one of the freest and fairest under very difficult circumstances that we've had in our history. And so this is not a normal policy difference between Republicans and Democrats, like, should taxes be higher or lower, or should we intervene, in the Middle East? This is a much more serious threat to, the most fundamental democratic institution, which is the right to vote. And one of the parties, I won't say which one, but one of the parties, is really basically taken a position that Trump articulated himself, which is that if everyone votes, no Republican will ever get elected in the future. And if you believe that, then you're not actually going to be that much in favor of democracy, and you're going to shift towards, a more, frankly, authoritarian position.
And you've also done writing not only about the dire consequences of identity politics, but maybe about some solutions. So I was wondering, how can we use notions of identity to integrate and unite rather than just to divide like we currently see all around us?
Well, let me answer that. I actually, though, want to say a little bit further on your previous question. By criticizing the Republicans, I don't want to let the left off the hook entirely, because I think that, one of the things that modern identity politics has done is to make a lot of progressives pretty intolerant. You see this, in certain sectors more than in others. So it's certainly there in academia, it's there in the arts, it's there in many cultural circles where there's really not a whole lot of tolerance for political difference. There's tolerance for diversity if it's related to race, ethnicity, gender, gender preference, and so forth, but not a whole lot of tolerance for people that, don't hold your particular progressive set of views. And I think that, that's it's a threat not to democracy, but to the liberal part of liberal democracy, because essentially, liberalism is a system based on tolerance. Now, the question that you asked, how do we get past this, is it's one that you can answer kind of in theory, but the real problem is how do you get there in practice? So I think that what we need to get back to is the kind of national identity that I certainly bought into after the civil rights era, which is to say that Americans are defined not by a race or ethnicity. They are defined by a commitment to shared democratic values, belief in the Constitution, in the rule of law, in the tradition of American democracy. And this is something that I think, really did appear. My family came from Japan, and I remember growing up, my father, who was also born in the United States, when I was confronted by someone making fun of me for being Asian, would say, no, just tell them that you're an American. And an American is somebody that believes in American values, and not defined by ethnicity or skin color. And unfortunately, that post-civil rights form of identity has really been challenged, most seriously by people on the right that actually want to drag us backwards into an identity that is defined by, by race or ethnicity, or even by, a certain set of conservative, political values. To overcome this, I think you basically need a different narrative that restores that earlier sense of what it means to be an American. There's been this huge clash over these competing national narratives of 1619 that's defined by racism, and 1776 that's defined by the all men are created equal phrase in the Declaration of Independence. And I think that actually it's not that hard to construct an American narrative that says, yes, we were born in racism, we had slavery, and then we had Jim Crow and segregation. On the other hand, over time, we have been able to overcome a lot of those problems, even though the problem of racism still is very present and continues to afflict American society. But unfortunately, right now, that's not where the national discussion is. I think that kind of historical narrative really has been challenged, by alternative ones that are, quite divisive.
Thank you for that, Professor. We've reached almost 2,000 people so far in our 30 minutes of discussion. And now, folks, we're going to go to the audience portion of the Q&A here. So we ask for a few things. 1, please wait for your name to be called on. 2, please remain civil under all circumstances, of course. And 3, please keep your question short so we show respect for others on stage who want to also ask a question. So on that note, I'm going to go to Royfield first. And then after Royfield, I want to go to Dr. Dan.
Hello, Professor Fank. Big fan. When I was in the early 90s, you were my political theorist of choice, sir. Read your books voraciously. You did a kind of a revision. You did an article in the Wall Street Journal back, about 2014, and you said that liberal democracy has no real competition from authoritarian systems of government. Do you still hold that to be true? We can look at many countries around the world that are striving economically, and they seem to be putting to one side our Western notions of liberal democracy, and some of them seem to be doing pretty well, and some of them are actually very happy without this notion of liberal democracy.
There are definitely a lot of countries that seem to be doing pretty well without democracy. And I think that, the question that I was trying to pose was not whether everybody would necessarily become a democracy, but whether there are really alternatives out there that are superior, that would eventually, attract a following. And, for many years, I've said that the only system I see in that position is really China, because China has managed to reach a very high level of technical sophistication. It's obviously grown economically. It's been very successful in innovation, and it's been very socially stable under, a tightening authoritarian government. And I've admitted right from the beginning that, as time goes on, and let's say another 20 years, if China looks like it's still going gangbusters and we're still mired in problems, then I'd say, yes, the Chinese alternative may actually be superior. And if that's really the case, I think more and more countries are going to follow, what they think is a Chinese model. I do think that, believers in the normative virtues of democracy like me, also have to accept the fact that there are many other approaches where you may adopt certain of the virtues of liberal democratic societies, but not all of them, and that those are valid ways of living as well. And I think we also have to recognize that getting to full-blown liberal democracy is really pretty hard, and it may not be that stable a position once you get there.
Thank you for that question, Royfield. As a reminder, folks, I did tweet out Frankly Fukuyama. It's the professor who's a rock star in his own right. It's his blog. So if you really want to get into what he's thinking about different events, please definitely click on that link, which you can see on my Twitter account. On that note, I wanted to go to Dr. Dan and then Andrea for a question.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. A great conversation as usual. Professor Fukuyama, thank you for being here. Great conversation. I'm a former Obama administration public health appointee in the biodefense and health space. I really appreciate your thoughts on this pandemic, given the fact that we've been dealing with an infodemic and a political landscape where science and politics are being conflated, and where there's an infodemic. When you look at this, what are maybe one or two key lessons that you would say we should have learned as we seem to keep re-experiencing this in terms of how best we can actually move forward, and what the roles of political, for example, health appointees like myself, Dr. Fauci, and others, when they're in these positions, how should it be during a public health emergency? Is it that their rules should ride, or is it based on whoever the leader, as in the leader of the nation, rules should rise? You've contrasted the big nations, those that are nationalists, versus those who have a democracy, and you've shown the difference that neither has been right. Is there a hybrid? What are your thoughts around that? Thank you.
Sure. No, that's a great question. And there's no question that technology has really made any kind of messaging about public health extremely difficult. The rise of the internet and social media has meant that essentially anyone can say anything they want. There are no more gatekeepers, that are there to vet the quality of information. And, Jonathan Rauch's new book, The Constitution of Knowledge, talks about what that old system was like for making sure that, there were certain checks on bad information. And those have really been blown away by technology. And the solution to that right now is not really obvious. I would say that the messaging throughout the pandemic has been, on the part of American public health authorities, has been anywhere from disastrous to, problematic. I mean, the disastrous one obviously was coming from the president last year, who simply, wasn't interested in public interest. He was interested in his own personal reelection, chances. And that was his lodestar for what he said about the pandemic. I do think that the public health authorities um, also could have done a better job because, and this actually applies even in the old Biden administration, where we're getting rather conflicting signals coming out of the CDC and other sources as to exactly what conditions, allow you to take off your masks or put on your masks, and whether schools are open or not. Now, part of that, I think, was inevitable because we simply didn't know a lot about the nature of the epidemic in the early days, and our knowledge, has changed, and so the guidance has changed. But there were probably too many things that were asserted with a great deal of certainty that probably should have been delivered in a bit more nuanced of fashion. This lab leak incident, where the virus came from, was a good example of, I think, public health messaging that was problematic, and in a sense, the opposite from Trump's messaging, where there was a strong move to deny the possibility that this was the result, that the coronavirus was a result of a lab leak. Now, there's been a lot of evidence that's come out that says that, it doesn't prove that that's where it happened, but it's at least a plausible hypothesis. And there was a kind of tendency on the part of, um, Trump's critics to basically take the opposite position pretty automatically from whatever he said. That's understandable. I did a lot of that myself. But I do think that, again, there needs to be better judgment exercised in terms of, building off of what's really pretty well established empirically before jumping to quick policy recommendations. So I don't know whether that constitutes a real answer to your question, but I think those are some of the considerations.
Thank you for that, Dr. Dan. We will go to Andrea, and then after Andrea, we will go to Greg. And folks, we have about 1,000 people in the room right now. So if you want to check out Professor Fukuyama's blog, Frankly Fukuyama, it's the top tweet on my profile. Just go to my profile here, click on my Twitter, and please click on his blog. It's absolutely awesome. So on that note, we will go to Andrea.
Hey, Justin, thank you and team for putting together this amazing room. And thank you, Professor, for being here. I apologize for any background noise. I'll try to be quick. Dr. Dan stole half of my question, but I will. So I would follow up to his question regarding technology and the social media platforms and ask your thoughts, Professor, on how we can, how they can best turn their force for good to unite rather than divide and combat the infodemic, and how we can hold them accountable. And then the next part is individuals. There were multiple institutions that, proved that the election was legitimate, that there was no substantial evidence of any substantial fraud, and yet people continued to believe it, partly because of amplification of misinformation, obviously also because of messaging from leaders. But at what point how do we hold, what is the role of individuals here? There were 80 plus million people who didn't vote. And, how can we mobilize them? And what is your thought about the role of individuals in terms of taking on democracy? Is a process, and it's like an ecosystem where we have to do our bit. And how do we kind of increase engagement, civic engagement? Thank you.
So I'm not sure I can answer all the questions you posed, but let's begin with the question of the platforms and their responsibility. I actually have written a fair amount about this over the past year because I have a specific proposal for how to deal with this called middleware. Now, there are several ways that you can control misinformation on the internet. One is simply by regulating it, and that's the approach that a lot of European countries and the European Union have taken. And so Germany criminalizes, the propagation of certain kinds of misinformation and so forth. We don't like regulation in the United States, and in any event, we've got a First Amendment that makes government regulation of speech, pretty difficult. And so, in default of that, we've tried to use political pressure to urge the big platforms to basically self-regulate. And quite frankly, they do that, invisibly on a non-political level. So things like pornography, child abuse, violence, beheadings are taken off their platforms. And I think, that function of controlling what they publish is not controversial and hasn't attracted a lot of criticism. The problem comes when they make political decisions as to what is acceptable political speech. Now, in legal terms, as a private organization, Facebook and Google and Twitter have a perfect right under the First Amendment to not carry something or to, carry something on their platforms. That's part of, what the First Amendment gives them the power to do. But I do think that their critics are right that they are so large and they can reach such a large audience and they can accelerate certain messages to such an extent that they, in effect, have become, kind of the public platform for speech in this country. And I really do not believe that a private profit-making corporation should have either the legitimacy or the capacity to make those sorts of decisions. And the real problem is their ability to basically amplify or take down certain kinds of political messages, that go beyond the pornography and so forth. You don't have any choice. If you don't like the way that Facebook is manipulating your feed, first of all, you don't even know how they're manipulating it, and you have no dials or knobs that you can turn in order to get them to change the way that they curate your content. And so, we argued that if you had a competitive layer of middleware companies, every user would be able to tailor what they saw on one of these platforms or in a Google search or on Twitter to suit what they wanted. And so that's an idea that's out there. The idea that, either the government or a big platform should really be the final arbiter of political speech, I think is really contrary to the spirit of the First Amendment. I don't think we can get rid of conspiracy theories and hate speech because, quite frankly, that stuff is protected by our First Amendment. And giving somebody, whether a platform or the government, the power to do that, you may like it in the short run when the hate speech is, coming out of these right-wing crazies, but, in some future world, it may be people on the left that are suffering from that. And I think that's why you've got something like the First Amendment that, in that sense is politically neutral. In a way, the later question about how you increase citizen awareness and involvement, I'm actually not sure how big a problem apathy was. The November 2020 election broke all of the records for voter turnout in our history, both on the Republican and Democratic sides. And you saw this, in a remarkable way with all of these people lining up to vote, in Atlanta and, Detroit and other places in ways that they had never done before. And it was really because, the stakes of politics seem to have increased dramatically in the last few years. Politics used to be boring to a lot of people, but now, they find it personally threatening and, they want to have their voices heard. And so there's been this huge, growth in civil society organizations. And I personally, I've got several former students that ran for office, and several of them actually won their elections. And that's never happened before, where people wanted to go into elective politics. And so I do think that there's been a positive increase in popular ownership of the Democratic process. And as long as there are threats to democracy, I expect that's probably going to continue.
So our next question will go to a big fan of yours, Professor Frank, Greg Sattel. And then after that, we will go to two-time Supreme Court clerk, Steve Crone, for a question.
Thanks, Justin. And thanks, Dr. Fukuyama, for spending some time with us. I think a sort of constant theme running through your writing over the last 30 years or so has been this Greek notion of thymos, or the need to be recognized. And in your last book, you argued, I thought quite strongly, that the sort of challenge we face is to integrate people's sense of identity into a sort of greater or societal type of recognition, which seems to be quite sensible. But, practically speaking, what do you do with a situation like we have now in Florida, where the governor there is arguing in favor, for instance, of parents need to be recognized in terms of their right to make choices for their child, where others are saying, yeah, I understand that need to be recognized, but not to the point where you're putting my child's health and safety at risk. How do we build a bridge there? How do we create some sort of commonality or sense of shared values through which we can integrate and unite identity? Because it seems to me in situations like that to be quite difficult.
No, there's no question about it. So, you can't recognize everybody. You give everybody a baseline recognition by granting them rights. So we have the right to speech and to the free exercise of religion under the First Amendment. We have a right to association. And ultimately, we have a right to vote. These are things that are shared by everyone. The problem with identity and the demand for recognition is that there are many, many other forms of recognition that people strive for. It's not enough simply to say, well, I'm a citizen, I can vote, and that's good enough for me. People want to be seen as part of they want to be proud of their ethnic or cultural heritage. They want to be proud of their region. They want to be proud of the language that they or their ancestors spoke. So there are many other sources of recognition beyond that universal recognition that a liberal society grants you. And I think that's really what's been driving a lot of our politics. And so, over the last 50 years, there's been a huge upsurge in, identities resulting from social movements, African Americans, women, gays and lesbians, and so forth, who had been marginalized and treated very unfairly by the mainstream in prior years, that wanted, recognition of their dignity. I mean, that's really what gay marriage was about, right? That you could have satisfied the economic requirements of a gay couple through a civil union, but it was only marriage that would say your union is as good and as dignified as that between a man and a woman. And that was really the issue. And now, with the rise of populism, you're now having, I think predominantly working class people who felt that they've been working hard in factories or raising families, and they get laid off by a big corporation that outsources its work to a distant country. And, they've been complaining about this, but nothing's happened because the elites all believed in free trade and globalization and so forth. And so they're angry and they feel that they have not been recognized, or, Christians who believe that the secularism in the country has become very militant and is really squeezing out their ability to, exercise their beliefs, freely and so forth. And so that's really the problem that we're getting into, where a lot of these more specific identities are butting up against one another and are ending up in conflict. I don't think at a certain level there's much we can do about this, because in a free society you have the freedom to choose your identity. I think you need to push back when those identities really undermine the fundamental rights of other people. So for example, taking away people's ability to vote, is really the current one that we're facing right now. But I think the ultimate solution is more of a positive one, where you have to offer a national identity that people find attractive. That people should want to live in a liberal society where they're free to make fundamental choices, to innovate, to do things differently. And that's the part that I think has really been missing in a lot of the current discussions over identity.
Thank you for that, Mr. Greg Sittel. We will go to Steve Crone and then Donna.
Hi, thanks so much, Professor. Two related questions. We've been talking a lot about sort of fixes, and I wanted to ask you about both the courts and engagement at the state level. In terms of courts, obviously the Supreme Court often has been a bulwark against some anti-democratic things, but I think in the wake of, among other things, Citizens United and the various decisions gutting the Voting Rights Act, that the courts in general, and the Supreme Court in particular, have become a problem in terms of a vibrant participatory democracy. So I want to ask you about that, and also your thoughts on engagement at the state level in state government, because we've also seen state governments, and this was alluded to in the prior question, as a problem in this regard. So wondering about your thoughts on fixes at those levels that could improve democracy.
Well, the Supreme Court question is a really complicated one. I think that the court has inserted itself into, some pretty controversial areas where it's not clear that they really have jurisdiction. This in many circles is not going to be a popular opinion, but I really do think that Roe v. Wade was a big mistake in many respects, because the finding of a new right, it seems to me, was problematic in the first place. But it seems to me that that's the kind of decision that really should have been left up to legislatures and voters, and probably would have gone in a liberalizing direction. But the courts, were a kind of convenient way of speeding up that process and bypassing obstacles in terms of democratic politics. And then that kind of set off this conservative backlash where every Supreme Court decision becomes a matter of existential fervor for all of the participants concerned. I don't think you can walk back that recent history in the courts. One thing you can do is actually term limit Supreme Court justices. So if they were limited to, an 18-year term, or even a 10-year term, the stakes in any given so right now, anyone that appoints a justice is going to pick somebody like in their early 40s if they can, like Amy Coney Barrett, because that means that she'll be around for the next 30, 40 years. But if you term limit justices, you'll lower the stakes somewhat. And I do think that a certain amount of restraint in going into areas that actually do constitute policy that legislatures ought to make is important. I'm sorry, the second question that you posed was what?
Participation at the state government level.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think I'm a believer in basic federalism. I do think that, basically the closer that decision makers and politicians are to the people that they are affecting, the better. And there are many decisions like taking out the garbage or, dealing with, let's say mudslides and fires in California are probably decisions that are probably best made, locally. And one of the big problems in American politics is that a lot of local politics has been pushed aside and nationalized. And so increasingly, these big national polarizations are inserting themselves into local decisions. One thing that's driving this is the decline of local media. This is a issue that I'm looking at in a project called California 100, which is looking at the impact of the decline of local media. If you don't have local media to interpret local problems and explain things to citizens, you're not going to have very good outcomes. And yet that's exactly what we've been experiencing. And so there's an ecosystem surrounding effective local governance that, has gotten pretty severely disrupted by technology. What the solution to this is, I think, is pretty complicated because there are some big economic incentives driving the nationalization of news and its absorption by these big, platforms. But I do think that that's one of the causes of our current political problems.
Thank you for that, Steve Crone. Now we're going to go to our last question of the discussion. Professor Fukuyama has been very generous and liberal with his time, small L there. We will go to Donna, and then we're going to ask Professor for his parting thoughts here with the audience of over 850 people. Donna, over to you.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Professor. I really liked your discussion on the pandemic. You raised this idea about different forms of government, democracy, other things. And as I was thinking about this, my work is largely in African studies and global health. And what democracy looks like on the continent can vary from place to place. And in some places, I'd say it's more viable long term than in other places. And of course, there are monarchy and other forms of rule on the African continent. But kind of going back to what you said, if we're thinking about different forms of rule, those that may be democratic or include some democratic elements as governments move forward, what would be some of the prevailing norms for systems that may not be quite democratic? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a complicated question. I think that if you look at the poll data that comes out of a survey like Afrobarometer, there's actually a very broad and deep consensus in favor of democracy throughout sub-Saharan Africa. It's actually quite remarkable. It's stronger than in other regions like in the Middle East or in East Asia. And so I do think that people want democracy. And there's been a long experience with dictatorial presidents that have overstayed their mandates and, really done a lot of damage to their societies, which is why I think that there was a big upsurge in, democratic protests and push for democracy beginning in the early 1990s. That being said, I think that, what a lot of African countries really need and don't have is not so much democratic contestation as actually a capable state. We Americans don't like the state and we distrust it because we think it's going to be, tyrannical. But if you don't have a state that is capable of delivering basic services like health, public health, or like education, or keeping basic public order, then a lot of the other good things that happen, on top of that kind of stability that a state provides aren't going to exist. And I think that those are kind of priorities for many countries in Africa, which are, they're riven by a lot of ethnic and other kinds of internal divisions, and that's kind of blocked them from actually creating modern impersonal states that are really capable of delivering good services. So this is why I think you've got to have a kind of balance between, effective states, but also constraints on that state through law or through democratic accountability that makes sure that whatever the state does doesn't go beyond, the boundaries of what citizens actually desire.
Thank you for that last question, Donna. Folks, we've been discussing really politics, political theory, and then in the practice of the real world we see around us, whether it be a response to COVID-19 or the power competition between the U.S. and CCP government, for example, with Professor Frank Fukuyama, a rock star in his own right. I felt like a kid in a candy shop. It has been a great honor, Professor, for you to be so generous with your time, reach over 4,000 people with your thoughts today. I was wondering if you had any last thoughts you wanted to leave the audience with, whether they be optimistic, pessimistic, or somewhere in between.
I guess the one thing I will say is a kind of plug. I actually remain a kind of classical liberal in many respects, despite everything and all the criticisms that have come about, because, I think that liberalism is a way of overcoming, it's a way of managing diversity, where you can learn to live with people that you don't agree with. And that's really what we need these days. And so that's what I've been thinking and writing about in recent times. What I have to say on this will be out in a short book that I'm going to publish next spring called Liberalism and Its Discontents. But that's the issue that I'm thinking and writing about right now. And, it's the position I want to defend.
That's all we have for you today on Politics and Media 101. If you like what you hear, if you dislike what you hear, if you want to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, please visit our website, pm101.club, where you can find all of that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning on behalf of my co-founder, Justin Higgins, and I, and our team. Thank you very much for joining. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.